Panama City Beach used to be the place everyone's family visited at least once. Sugar white sand, warm Gulf water, cheap motels, and a boardwalk that never seemed to sleep. But lately, something has shifted. Hotel rooms are sitting empty in the middle of summer. Longtime visitors are quietly booking elsewhere. So today we're looking at why nobody wants to visit Panama City Beach anymore. The spring break reputation nobody can shake. For decades, Panama City Beach wore a nickname like a badge of honor, the spring break capital of the world. Back in the 1960s and 70s, local leaders actually went looking for that reputation. Bay County's tourist season used to last about 90 days a year, and officials wanted a way to fill the calendar. Spring break did that job well. College kids poured in by the busload, bars opened earlier, and for a while, the arrangement worked out fine for everybody involved. Then, it stopped working. On March 28, 2015, a house party in Panama City Beach turned into a shooting that left 7 people wounded, 3 of them critically. The shooter was arrested within hours and later sentenced to 7 life terms, but the damage to the town's image had already been done. A local law enforcement official who responded to the scene later said it felt like being in a war zone. The following year, the city passed a wave of ordinances. No alcohol on the sand during March, bars closing at 2 a.m., tighter rules around parking and balconies. For a few years, it actually seemed to calm things down. Then, 2025 happened. Over just a few weeks that spring, Panama City Beach saw multiple shootings, hundreds of arrests, and thousands of calls for service to law enforcement. Deputies wrote out more than 600 citations and arrested over 200 people in one stretch alone. Officials say a lot of the chaos wasn't even coming from the college students the town had built its reputation on. It was outside criminal groups, some of them reportedly the same people who'd caused trouble in Miami the week before, showing up looking for an easier target. Guns were seized by the dozens. The city's police chief didn't mince words about what came next, telling residents plainly, that time is over. It wasn't the first time frustration had boiled over either. A few years earlier, spring break crowds got so large and unruly that police shut down a 2-mile stretch of Front Beach Road entirely, and several businesses along the strip, including a Walmart, closed early rather than deal with the chaos. Chief Talamantes described the scene at the time as revelers acting a fool, which, if you've seen the footage, is putting it gently. That's not a metaphor. Panama City Beach spent 2026 rolling out some of the strictest spring break rules it has ever had. Alcohol banned on the sand for the entire month of March. A curfew for unaccompanied minors starting at 8 p.m. Only guests 21 and older allowed to book vacation rentals during peak weeks. And for the first time, the city started closing entire sections of beach overnight, from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., in the areas that had caused the most trouble, shutting down beach access points behind some of the most popular bars on the strip. Here's the thing about a reputation, though. It's a lot easier to earn than it is to shed. Panama City Beach spent years marketing itself as a rowdy party town, and now that it desperately wants families and retirees instead, plenty of travelers still associate the name with headlines about shootings and mass arrests. You can't unring that bell with a press release. Meanwhile, the college crowd that used to fill hotel rooms in March is starting to hear the message loud and clear and simply going somewhere with fewer rules and less police presence. So the town is caught in an awkward middle ground, too tame now for the crowd it used to attract, and still too associated with chaos for the crowd it's trying to attract instead. The skyline nobody asked for. Drive down Front Beach Road today, and you'll notice something that longtime visitors love to complain about: the condos. Not just a few of them. Wall-to-wall high-rises, stacked shoulder to shoulder, along nearly the entire beachfront, blocking views that used to be open to anyone walking the shore. Locals have taken to describing the strip as looking like a theme park built entirely out of concrete towers, and it's not exactly a compliment. This didn't happen by accident. Panama City Beach has leaned hard into short-term rentals as its main economic engine, and the numbers back that up. Short-term rental inventory jumped by roughly 44% in a single recent summer season, as more and more houses and condo units got converted from actual homes into weekly vacation rentals. That's fantastic news if you own a rental property. It's a lot less fantastic if you're a local trying to find a place to live, because rental prices and home values have climbed to the point where longtime residents say they're being priced right out of the town they grew up in. One resident describing the shift put it simply: the downside of living there now is the tourists themselves, because so much of the local housing supply has been swallowed up by short-term rentals. And it's not just about housing costs. Some of these towers are getting old. In late 2025, an entire condo building on Thomas Drive, one built back in 1974, was shut down completely after inspectors found serious structural cracks in the walkways connecting units on the upper floors. Full evaluation deemed the building unsafe to occupy until repairs were finished. That's the kind of story that spreads fast among people already anxious about vacationing in Florida. High-rises, since the Surfside condo collapse in 2021, made national headlines and pushed the state to toughen its structural inspection requirements. Older visitors who first came to Panama City Beach decades ago often described the change in almost geological terms. A low, open shoreline dotted with modest motels slowly replaced, tower by tower, until the beach itself became the backdrop rather than the main attraction. Add it all up, and you get a beach town that looks less like the sleepy Florida panhandle getaway older visitors remember, and more like a wall of towers, competing for the same strip of sand. For a lot of travelers who used to come back year after year for the small town, low-key vibe, that transformation alone has been enough to send them looking elsewhere. Getting there is half the battle. Even if none of the above bothers you, there's a more basic problem waiting for anyone who drives to Panama City Beach in the summer: actually getting around once you arrive. The main highway feeding the beach, US 98, was designed to comfortably handle around 45,000 vehicles a day. During peak summer months, traffic engineers say that number can climb as high as 80,000. That's nearly double what the road was ever built for, funneled through the same handful of lanes. Front Beach Road, the scenic strip that runs past most of the hotels, restaurants, and attractions, tends to grind to a near standstill on weekend mornings. And during peak spring weeks, it can stay clogged essentially all day. The area around Pier Park, the beach's main shopping and dining hub, is consistently named by county infrastructure officials as one of the worst congestion points in the entire region. City council members have openly discussed traffic studies, ride-sharing incentives, and even dedicated transit lanes to try to unclog the corridor, which tells you how seriously local government is taking a problem that, for visitors, usually just means sitting in a rental car for 45 minutes to travel 2 miles. It's not only an inconvenience either. Bay County recorded well over 3,400 traffic crashes in a recent year, with dozens of fatalities, and officials specifically point to the high-volume tourist season as a contributing factor. A local resident summed up the seasonal reality bluntly during one particularly gridlocked holiday weekend, saying the traffic was simply very thick. For a vacation that's supposed to be about relaxing, spending your first and last hour of every beach day stuck in a line of cars baking in the Florida sun isn't exactly the selling point Panama City Beach wants people talking about. The cost of cheap Florida. Panama City Beach built its whole identity around being the affordable alternative to places like Destin or South Florida. That was the pitch for decades. Same warm water, same white sand, half the price. These days, a lot of visitors say that pitch doesn't hold up anymore. Vacation rental prices climbed sharply in the years following the pandemic travel boom, and they haven't exactly come back down. Add to that the extra fees that seem to multiply every season: resort fees, cleaning fees, parking fees that can run $30 a day on top of what guests already paid for their condo. Guests booking Gulfront resorts have openly complained about paying a premium for their room and then being hit with a separate daily charge just to park their own car, only to find the lot too small to guarantee a spot late at night. Then there's the maintenance side of the ledger. Guests at some of the beach's most recognizable resorts have reported slow elevators, broken appliances, and rooms that clearly hadn't been deep cleaned in a while, alongside genuinely kind staff who, by their own admission, don't have the authority to fix bigger problems caused by management decisions above their pay grade. When you're paying prices that rival more polished destinations but getting an experience that feels stretched thin, the budget beach town reputation starts to crack. Family travel budgets have felt this shift the hardest. A trip that used to be genuinely affordable for a family of 4 now competes on price, with destinations that offer noticeably more polish And plenty of parents doing that math out loud on travel forums and review sites have started asking whether the extra savings are still worth the trade-offs. When a budget beach town starts pricing itself within striking distance of a more upscale one, it loses the one advantage that used to make all its other flaws easy to overlook. None of this happens in a vacuum either. Airlines and travel patterns shifted noticeably after the pandemic travel surge cooled off, and Panama City Beach's regional airport reported passenger traffic down roughly 3% in a recent June compared to the year before. Local officials have been quick to point out that this isn't unique to Bay County. Airports across the country and the region have seen similar softening. But when travelers are already deciding between destinations that cost roughly the same, a town known for shootings, construction, and surprise parking fees has a harder time winning that comparison than it used to. A storm that never really left. You can't tell the story of Panama City Beach's recent decade without talking about Hurricane Michael. On October 10, 2018, Michael slammed into the Florida Panhandle near Tyndall Air Force Base as a Category 5 hurricane, one of the strongest storms to ever make landfall on the U.S. mainland, with sustained winds reported around 160 miles per hour. It devastated communities from Panama City Beach all the way to Mexico Beach, which lost an estimated 80% of its structures. Michael generated roughly 72 million tons of debris across the Panhandle, about 10 times what Hurricane Irma left behind the year before. Panama City Beach itself wasn't hit quite as directly as Mexico Beach or Panama City proper, but the surrounding region took years to recover, and that recovery is still ongoing in some neighborhoods. Federal agencies poured more than $3 billion into disaster relief and rebuilding across the affected counties. Tyndall Air Force Base alone reported around 484 buildings destroyed or rendered unusable, with damage estimated near $5 billion just on that base. Businesses across the region shut down for months. Grocery stores and gas stations disappeared from entire zip codes. And even years later, reporting has shown that some lower-income neighborhoods in the area still haven't fully recovered, tangled up in FEMA paperwork requirements that don't account for how rural Florida families actually pass down property. For visitors, the hurricane left a quieter, longer-lasting mark too, a reminder that this stretch of coast sits directly in the crosshairs of hurricane season every single year. Newer high-rises are being built to stricter wind codes now, which is good news structurally, but it hasn't erased the psychological math a lot of travelers do before booking a beach vacation in the Panhandle between June and November. Insurance costs for coastal properties in the region have climbed as a direct result of storms like Michael, and those costs eventually get passed down to renters in the form of higher nightly rates. A storm that made landfall years ago is still quietly showing up on people's vacation bills today. There's also a less tangible cost that doesn't show up on any spreadsheet. Residents who lived through Michael describe it in terms that sound more like a battlefield than a weather event. One Panama City Beach mayor at the time compared the sound of it to being in a war for the 15 minutes it lasted overhead. Stories like that circulate for years afterward, passed along by locals to curious visitors asking what the area is really like during hurricane season. It's one thing to know intellectually that Florida gets hurricanes. It's another to sit in a beachfront condo, hearing first-hand accounts of a Category 5 tearing the roofs off buildings a few miles down the coast. That kind of lingering unease doesn't stop people from booking trips entirely, but it does nudge some toward destinations that feel a little further removed from the bullseye of Hurricane Alley, or at least toward inland alternatives when a named storm is already spinning in the Gulf during their planned travel week. The seaweed problem nobody warns you about. Even when the weather cooperates, the water itself hasn't always been cooperating. Panama City Beach, like much of the Gulf Coast, deals with seasonal waves of sargassum, a brown, free-floating seaweed that drifts in from the Atlantic and Caribbean and piles up on shorelines from roughly late April through early September. On its own, sargassum isn't dangerous. Marine scientists actually consider it a valuable habitat, sheltering baby fish, shrimp, and even sea turtles as it drifts. But when a thick mat of it rots on the sand in the Florida sun for a few days straight, it produces a smell that guests have compared to rotten eggs, and it's not exactly the postcard image anyone pictures when they book a beach vacation. Researchers monitoring the Atlantic have flagged some recent years as record-breaking for sargassum volume, with satellite tracking showing seaweed belts stretching thousands of miles across the ocean before making landfall on Gulf and Atlantic beaches alike. Panama City Beach tends to fare better than some other Florida coastlines because of how currents move through the northern Gulf, and the city does send crews out to rake the worst of it off popular stretches of sand. But usually not as bad as Miami, isn't much of a selling point when travelers are choosing between destinations for a once-a-year vacation. Red tide is a separate, less predictable threat that shows up more often in fall than summer, caused by a different type of algae altogether. When it blooms, it can kill fish in large numbers and irritate the lungs of anyone standing too close to the shoreline, especially people with asthma or other respiratory conditions. It hasn't hit Panama City Beach every year, and some recent seasons have been mercifully quiet on that front, but the uncertainty itself is part of the problem. Nobody wants to spend hundreds of dollars on a beachfront condo only to find out 2 days before departure that the beach they booked is covered in rotting algae or posted with a health advisory. What makes it worse is timing. The heaviest sargassum season overlaps almost exactly with peak family vacation months, when school is out and everyone is trying to book the same few weeks of summer. A destination can have the cleanest water in the state for 11 months of the year, and it won't matter if the 1 week a family happened to book falls right when the seaweed piles up. Scientists who track these blooms have started describing certain recent years as record-setting for total volume, which means the odds of running into a bad week keep climbing rather than settling down when the building itself becomes the problem. Florida tightened its rules around aging condominium buildings after the Surfside collapse in Miami in 2021, and those new structural inspection requirements have started catching up with some of Panama City Beach's older properties. In late 2025, an entire condo building along Thomas Drive, built back in 1974, was shut down completely after engineers found visible stress cracks in the walkway structures connecting the 6th and 7th floors. What started as a partial closure quickly became a full shutdown once inspectors determined the whole building posed a life safety risk until repairs were finished. Stories like that spread fast, and they land differently than they would have a decade ago. Travelers who might have shrugged off news like this before Surfside now think twice about booking an older beachfront tower, especially when newer, better inspected buildings are available in nearby markets. Panama City Beach has plenty of gorgeous, well-maintained resorts, to be fair, but its skyline also includes a lot of aging concrete built decades before today's stricter codes existed, and the state's new inspection rules are slowly revealing which of those buildings were quietly overdue for serious repairs. For an industry that depends on people trusting a building enough to hand over a security deposit and sleep 12 floors above the ocean, that's not a small issue. The financial ripple effects reach further than the closed building itself. Once one property in an area gets flagged for serious structural problems, owners' association fees tend to spike across similar-aged buildings nearby, as boards rush to fund inspections and repairs before state regulators come knocking. Those higher fees eventually get baked into nightly rental rates, which means guests booking a completely unrelated, perfectly safe condo down the street can still end up paying more because of a building they've never even seen. It's an invisible tax on the entire market, triggered by decades-old construction decisions nobody currently renting a unit had any say in, and one that shows no sign of easing as more panhandle buildings reach the age where these inspections become mandatory. What the numbers actually say. Strip away the anecdotes for a second, because the raw data tells its own story. According to Panama City Beach's own Tourist Development Council, visitation during the spring quarter of a recent year dropped by about 1.4% compared to the year before. That might sound small, but it followed several years of the area's tourism industry growing at a rapid pace, with revenue and visitation up roughly 50% since 2020 during the pandemic-era travel boom. Going from steady growth to a decline, even a modest one, is the kind of shift that gets noticed by everyone from hotel general managers to the city council. The area's regional airport reported passenger traffic down about 3% one recent June compared to the year before, a trend officials described as mirroring what's happening at airports across the country as post-pandemic travel patterns settle into something new and less explosive. To their credit, tourism officials in Bay County have mostly framed this as a normal correction after a few unusually strong years rather than a full-blown crisis, and they've pointed to airport expansion plans and new flight routes as reasons for optimism heading into the future. But a slight dip in visitor numbers paired with rising short-term rental inventory means something specific. More rooms are chasing fewer guests, which puts pressure on nightly rates and on the businesses that depend on steady foot traffic to survive. Local business owners along the Strip have started noticing quieter weekday afternoons, even during what used to be reliably busy stretches of summer. And some have adjusted staffing and inventory accordingly, rather than betting on the same wall-to-wall crowds they used to plan around. When the county's Tourist Development Council brought in an outside strategic planning firm to dig into the spring quarter numbers, the presentation didn't point to one single culprit. Instead, it laid out a mix of factors: economic pressure on travelers, shifting post-pandemic habits, and a broader new normal, settling in after a few years of unsustainable growth. Tourism officials have generally chosen to frame that as a leveling off rather than a warning sign. And there's a reasonable argument for that read. Growth of 50% in 4 years was never going to continue forever, and a small pullback after a boom that dramatic isn't the same thing as a collapse. Still, a leveling off in visitor numbers combined with a growing supply of short-term rentals is a specific kind of math problem for a tourism-dependent economy. None of this means Panama City Beach is empty. It's still a major Gulf Coast destination with millions of annual visitors. It just means the town's long streak of uninterrupted growth has hit a wall. And the reasons behind that wall are the exact ones we've been walking through. Everyone went somewhere else instead. Every destination that loses momentum loses it to somewhere. In Panama City Beach's case, a chunk of its traditional audience has been drifting toward quieter, less developed stretches of the Florida Panhandle and Alabama Gulf Coast, places like Rosemary Beach, Grayton Beach, or the more residential far western edge of Panama City Beach itself, ironically, where high-rises are scarcer and the pace is slower. Families who used to book the busiest stretch of Front Beach Road are increasingly choosing destinations that market themselves specifically as the anti-Panama City Beach. Fewer crowds, fewer condos, and none of the spring break headlines. Other travelers have simply traded the Panhandle for entirely different coastlines altogether, chasing destinations along the Atlantic side of Florida or even out-of-state beach towns that never built a reputation problem in the first place. Meanwhile, nearby markets like Destin and 30A have leaned hard into upscale branding, positioning themselves as the polished, family-first alternative, even though their prices have climbed just as fast, if not faster. What makes that competition sting is how close it is geographically. Someone driving to the Florida Panhandle from Georgia, Alabama, or Tennessee can just as easily continue another 30 or 40 minutes down the highway to reach 30A's quieter beach communities, or head the opposite direction toward the Alabama coastline around Gulf Shores and Orange Beach, which has spent recent years marketing itself as a calmer, more family-oriented answer to exactly the reputation Panama City Beach is trying to shed. Panama City Beach isn't losing visitors to some distant, unreachable destination. In a lot of cases, it's losing them to towns close enough to see on the same road trip, which makes every one of its problems feel that much more avoidable to the traveler comparing brochures. A family cross-referencing two destinations that are barely an hour apart doesn't need much of a reason to pick the one without the recent headlines about shootings, closed condo towers, or gridlocked highways, especially when the sand and water look nearly identical in both places. There's a bit of irony sitting underneath all of this. Panama City Beach is actively trying to remake itself right now, leaning into family-friendly branding, ecotourism angles like guided fishing charters that teach conservation, and infrastructure upgrades meant to attract exactly the kind of calmer, higher-spending visitor other towns already claimed years ago. Whether that rebrand works is genuinely an open question. Reputations built over a decade of viral spring break chaos don't get erased by a new tourism campaign overnight, and the town is essentially competing for the same families it used to actively push away with a wilder image. Where this leaves Panama City Beach. None of this means Panama City Beach is finished. It still has genuinely beautiful water, dependable weather most of the year, and infrastructure that dwarfs plenty of smaller beach towns nearby. But still has good beaches isn't the same thing as worth the hassle, and that's the gap the town is currently stuck trying to close. a reputation earned through years of viral spring break chaos, a skyline that grew faster than the local infrastructure could handle, rising costs that erased its old budget-friendly identity, a hurricane whose financial aftershocks are still showing up in insurance bills, seasonal seaweed that shows up right on schedule every summer, and aging buildings now facing overdue safety scrutiny. That's a lot of baggage for one beach town to carry at once. Whether Panama City Beach turns this around probably depends on how consistently it can enforce its new spring break rules, how quickly older buildings get brought up to code, how seriously it tackles a traffic problem that's outgrown its own roads, and whether its rebrand toward families and ecotourism actually sticks, instead of just being a marketing slogan. Tourism officials in Bay County are clearly aware of the stakes, and to their credit, a lot of the changes rolling out over the last 2 years are aimed directly at the problems we've walked through today, rather than papering over them. Whether that's enough to bring back the crowds that used to fill this stretch of coastline every single summer is something only the next few seasons will actually answer. For now, though, it's easy to see why a lot of longtime visitors have quietly started booking somewhere else, and why so many people are asking why nobody wants to visit Panama City Beach anymore. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it and subscribe for more videos just like this one.